journalist, and secondly, as a human rights and freedoms advocate. So I want to welcome everyone who's tuning in right now for us. And first, I want to make a brief introduction about our two panelists. First things first, Diane Foley could not join us today. She had an urgency overseas, but Diane is a humanitarian justice advocate. She's the mother of the American journalist James Foley. But I'm sure that we will have the opportunity to host her and to discuss this with her in some other time. I would like to welcome my two other guests, Matthew Caruana Galizia. Matthew, you're an investigative journalist and you also run the Daphne Galizia Foundation. Daphne was your mother and she was assassinated or killed in 2017 in a car bombing. So welcome, Matthew. I can of course touch base on and sense on how important impunity and ending impunity is to you personally and professionally. So thank you for being here with us today. And also I want to welcome Khalid Ibrahim, Khalid from the Gulf Center for Human Rights. We had the occasion to meet briefly before and to also discuss human rights and journalism in the Arab region. So thank you so much for joining us. Now I'm going to step out of my shoes as a journalist and ask you, and start maybe with Khalid to ask you this question, and then turn it over to Matthew. This big, bold question that we all tend to ask ourselves from time to time: is there a way to secure a free and safe environment for journalists? And I'm asking this because the title of our panel is Ending Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, which seems like an almost impossible mission these days. So Khalid, the floor is yours. Khalid, we can't hear you. You are muted. Yes.
So
we can hear
thank you a lot, Lona, for such an important question. First of all, I have to thank the Samir Qasir Foundation for hosting this important discussion about ending impunity for crimes against journalists. We always have to offer solutions for chronic problems such as safety for journalists in our region. We know that our region is the most dangerous area for journalistic work, and we have the statistics that confirm this. The important question is, what are the possible realistic solutions? Surely it is not our mission to change repressive governments and fight terrorist groups that monitor and target journalists, as we believe in peaceful, positive change as the only way forward. As such, we can easily suggest some of the interconnected ways to secure a safe environment for journalists. I know we are facing now series of crises, including human rights crisis in our countries, but we need to claim the space available to us. So number one, I think there should be a focus on evacuation to a safe place. This is an important action that we always need to implement when a journalist is facing an imminent risk. It could, if properly implemented, save lives. And then we go to some other tools and ways and manners, like protecting journalists digitally in the light of the ongoing cyber attacks. That is also very important. We have a lot of verified stories about how the hacking of my colleague blogger Ahmed Mansour and journalist Jamal Khashoggi led to the imprisonment of Ahmed and the killing of Jamal. So digital security is very important, and let us say that making the internet safe for journalists should be a priority. Then there is a need for journalists themselves to assess their personal safety, their personal situation, to see, are they targeted, are they at risk, are they about to publish an article about corruption. Then they need to keep their organization updated with their whereabouts and contact methods. there should be an editorial policy as well. Check with your organization, with other right journalist rights NGOs, the guidelines to keep your sources safe. Go the extra mile to protect your local sources. Keep their details private. Always blur your name, user ID, and profile if needed when you use social media network, and also networking with international organizations. This is very important. And then we talk about the long run. To be honest with you, it is about changing the mentalities of the states, is to changing the mentality of officials. They have to look at the journalistic work and at journalists as partners to build a prosperous future for everybody. Thank you.
Khalid, you're raising some very important points. I want to turn it over to Matthew because I think that we're talking about the Arab context, but it's also international when it comes to the safety of journalists, right? I mean, we always used to think that the Arab world is different and we're facing some extra, threats or challenges. But now that things are happening worldwide, from digital problems and digital safety risks to physical risks to the wars that are erupting in different regions, it seems that everything is kind of collided together. So, Matthew, what do you think is a way to secure a kind of free and safe space for journalists despite the borders that are separating different countries?
So when my mother was murdered in 2017, one of the biggest challenges for us to overcome in the public sphere was to explain to people precisely what you're saying, that it is not an accident that my mother was murdered. It wasn't a kind of freak incident or something that is unlikely to ever happen again. We had to make a great effort to communicate that the murder happened, or the act was committed as a result of there being grand corruption in the country, great amounts of corruption in the country. It was linked to kleptocracy, state capture. These are phenomena that we're not really used to talking about within the European Union, because the impression within the Union itself is that since the beginning, everything has been fine. But what happened in Malta and other member states is that due to a lack of enforcement that followed the opening up of trade, corruption was allowed to take root. And once it took root, it became very difficult to control. And actually, when you look at the statistics, not just in the European Union, but globally, most journalists are murdered, not in war zones, although a great number are, especially right now, but due to their work on covering politics and corruption. More than 60% of those murders are linked to those themes. Once we overcame that sort of gap in understanding, and we could show to people that, look, the murder is linked to corruption, then people began to focus on the real causes of impunity, which are a collapse in the rule of law, out of control corruption, out of control organized crime. And still, almost 5 years later, this is what we're now working on. We have these twin aims: justice for my mother, and of course, making sure that it doesn't happen again by tackling organized crime, by tackling high-level corruption.
And I want to also use this opportunity to also remind anyone who's watching us that Lebanon is not really further away from the assassination cycle. Samir Asir himself was assassinated also in Lebanon. He was a prominent journalist and political activist and human rights advocate as well. So it's no longer about one region, and effectively it has never been about one region, but it seems that somehow, and this is maybe from my perspective as a journalist, we lose track of how wide the cycle of impunity is worldwide, because really we're not getting our own justice in our own countries, in our own contexts. And so I would like to ask this question to Khalid. in terms of justice, when it comes to crimes committed against journalists or even attacks, if we want to take it into, you know, the small daily or monthly attacks that happen against journalists, but also in terms of big crimes. In your opinion, Khalid, as someone who follows up on this from a humanitarian point of view, what has the world done? Did the world really do anything? Did we witness any type of tangible change in the past few years that we maybe were not really seeing because we're so angry and we're so despaired? You're muted again, Khalid. So
thank you for this question. And really, it is very useful to see at the national level what countries have conducted in terms of crimes against journalists. And I recall the killing 25 years ago of Veronica Curran. At the time I was in Ireland, she began writing exposes about organized crimes for the Sunday Independence. So in brief, an Irish crime reporter was murdered by drug lords. So the public demanded immediately action and believed the government had not done enough to stop organized crime. And suddenly all the changes have taken place and quickly, including the creation of the criminal asset bureau and the use of special criminal court and special forces. And the outcome was massive, really full of protection for journalists in Ireland. That is the kind of actions we need in our countries. If we talk about the world, really, to be honest with you, the only the action that we have support from foreign countries is the use of the concept of international jurisdiction. We managed to make some cases, and RSF, Reporter Without Borders, and others, and now we are assessing some cases of killed journalists across the MENA region. So we are trying to use the foreign judiciaries to force perpetrators to face justice. That is the only way forward in our countries. The fact that there is no any local remedy. Where you go, we have hundreds of journalists who were killed in different ways. Some of them by torture, some of them by bullet in daylight, and others by explosive device planted in their cars. So, and still the killing is ongoing. And I think the international community really has little to offer to the victims due to, you know, the geopolitical context that we have in our region. But still, we shouldn't lose the hope. And we started these cases using the judicial, the foreign judiciaries, and still international community needs to take other actions to support journalists in our region and other regions. Yes.
what do you think, Matthew, regarding the world and what has it done so far in terms of justice?
I think that's a really good point, because there are, we need to separate the problems. So there's the issue where, I mean, I would be silly to compare, for example, Malta to Lebanon, because here we have access to the European Court of Human Rights, MEPs in the European Parliament, access to the European Commission. These really allow for international intervention that is not possible in countries that are not members of the European Union. So it would be wrong to make it seem as though the situations for victims of crime against journalists are equivalent. But separately to the problem of a lack of integration in international systems that allow for pathways to justice, there is also the problem of access to existing systems for the family members of victims or the victims themselves if they're still alive. Even within the European Union, the Fundamental Rights Agency has found that the greatest problem impeding justice within the European Union is access to justice itself. There is a language barrier for the families, a monetary barrier. Sometimes they don't have the funds required to fight cases or to intervene legally. So this is a big problem worldwide. And I would like to see better support globally for the family members of victims of murder, or the victims themselves, if they're still alive, to allow them to better access existing mechanisms.
Do you think, Matthew, being someone who experienced this firsthand, do you think that having politicians or having civil society members who have access to the judiciary system, who have access to governments, and maybe directly to the international society sometimes, even you being someone from sort of the international society, do you think that this is also vital? One thing I have been, and I'm saying this because it's one thing that we have been debating sometimes in Lebanon, in the Arab world, is that it's not only about what we can advocate for. Sometimes you need to push it forward. Sometimes you need someone on the inside. You need politicians, you need entities who can advocate that freedoms, that impunity is as important as economic and social rights. What's your take on that?
I mean, look, that's obviously important, and there would not be justice in my mother's case if all of us together had not been fighting so hard. My family, I mean, I come from a big family. We all used whatever we had to fight for justice for my mother. We were assisted by NGOs from all over the world. We were assisted by members of parliament, both nationally and within the European Parliament and within the Council of Europe. So there was, there was a lot of teamwork, and I think this is what really allowed us to get close to justice for my mother. But I mean, we need to look at the statistics. Justice in my mother's case is one thing, but it's been said that the definition of stupidity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. So journalists keep being murdered. The impunity rate keeps rising. We are not pushing it down. If we get justice for my mother, we are not even going to knock it down by 1%. Of course, it will send a huge signal globally that there are people who are prepared to fight, and that creates a deterrent effect. But of course, we cannot keep relying on the few family members who are willing to fight. We cannot keep on relying on the limited capacity of civil society organizations, prosecutors, police, and politicians. This is what we have been doing all of this time, and we are not managing to knock down the impunity rate. So of course, something has to be done differently.
Khaled, one question that comes to mind when we're talking about impunity and about journalists' rights and safety is the state of institutions in the Arab world. First things first, before we look more widely into the whole world, do you think that we can really ensure full safety or a sort of full safety for journalists, at least for people to be held responsible when they do attack or kidnap or attempt to assassinate or even succeed in assassinating a journalist? Do you think that there's a way that we can assure that journalists have their rights supported in times where state institutions are barely functioning? We have so many examples. Sometimes you have examples of state institutions that are functioning perfectly, but there's a link or a hook that is missing, which is related to human rights. So what do you think?
Well, to be honest with you, like when we talk about institutions that are part of the governments, the oppressive governments, the image is very black in terms of safety. There is no any cooperation, there is no any intention, there is no any even legislations that will force them to protect the work of journalists. like we are a lot of national human rights institutes across the MENA region. They are all funded by governments. Unfortunately, they are not ready to release a statement to condemn the imprisonment of a blogger like Ahmed Mansour, my colleague, or to demand respect for the freedom of the media and the protection of the work of independent journalists. So it is all about the mentality that we have in the official ruling states. The mentality is such that regard any journalist who is writing about corruption, about democracy, about human rights, about public freedoms, including the freedom of the press, this journalist is an enemy. So we just, as I said earlier, we just need to change this mentality. It is all about respecting public freedoms, including the freedom of the press. No creativity in any society without respecting public freedoms. Journalists, they are our partners in building a future for every single citizen. We just need to change this mentality. The change is coming, but it is taking a long time. Until that time, we can't say that working on sensitive news and sensitive stories on corruption, for example, something that is safe, can be conducted safely in our countries. And we have a lot of stories. Believe me, on occasions, we just move people from their cities to another country just because they wrote something about corruption or they intended to publish stories. We have a lot of stories, not just us, other NGOs. And in general, briefly, I tell you, an oppressive government is not going to protect independent journalists. That is really the conclusion across the MENA region.
Of course. I want to jump to Thomas Durkin and take it a bit more maybe internationally, given that we don't have Diane Foley with us today, but I think that you can also jump in on this very important week or a couple of weeks, if I may say, especially that James Foley's murderers are now effectively under trial. So to take it a bit more internationally, sometimes we have impunity, but sometimes we do get those who attacked, who killed, who kidnapped to trial. What is your take on this? Because we understand that the pain does not go away. It's a loss that you cannot actually recount in your life, but there's a way with it, which is justice sometimes, just as is happening now. So what is your take on this from your perspective?
Well, yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm sorry that Diane could not be here today. She was at the trial, and as you mentioned, she had another emergency come up. I think it's really important that the trial's taking place, and that there was combined efforts internationally to make sure that it happened. There has to be some level of consequence or justice that comes out. And going back to Matthew's point, like this is one trial. It's about it's Jim and Stephen Sotlaw, and is it going to make a huge difference? Probably not. It's small percentage-wise, but I think it's important to show that there are consequences and that there will be a trial and that people will keep trying to bring people to justice that harm journalists or aid workers. The other thing I wanted to circle back to, I think has been really interesting, and this goes to Khalid's point, like about how it's going to take a long time, is I think one of the things we really need to focus on is media literacy globally, and understanding what journalists are when we think about this idea of media. And we've got, it would be a long process, but we have to get back to citizenry realizing how important journalism is. And I think if we don't get them back on our side and they fall for this idea that it's enemy of the people or it's fake news, that it's an uphill battle that becomes increasingly more difficult. And the more we can inform the public of how important journalists are to their lives, I think we'd be better off. And then this whole idea of like, can we secure a free and safe journalism? Probably not. I mean, journalists are like first responders. It's no longer just going to conflict zones. Like, journalists are targeted, doing some things that years past might have seemed more mundane, but I think we can start with journalists at a young age, recognizing the importance of safety training, not as an add-on to being a journalist, but actually a part of the toolbox, the skill set of being a journalist. So I think these things all tie together. That's why I think these are such important conversations. Like, the value of journalists, I mean, I don't think it could ever be overstated. And I think we're at a really important time, like, where how we consume news and how we get it and what we're paying attention to.
Thank you, Thomas, for highlighting the safety of journalists. Also, I think that this is one thing that I can say, that as a Lebanese journalist, at least in my time at my university, my education did not include any type of safety tips or on how you can report, how you should actually report safely. And now we live in a region where wars are prone to erupt at any given moment. So yes, media literacy, but also a curriculum maybe on media safety in universities is something that I personally would dream to see, especially in the MENA region. Thomas, we're going to get back to you as well. But I also want to see with Matthew, because he did mention, he was nodding and he was very approving of the point that the attitude of the leadership is important. So what's your idea on that, Matthew, when it comes to maybe if we want to talk about leadership that is a bit beyond the scope of politics and of local politics, but maybe also the cooperation that is happening between journalists from different regions, how they support one another, knowing that we come from different contexts and that the assassinations and the attacks might be different in location, but they are kind of repetitive.
I don't want to I didn't want to give the impression that that we're super pessimistic over here, but I just wanted to emphasize that this is in a way the nature of democracy. We just have to keep fighting for everything, and sort of all improvements are very hard won. I have no doubt that if we continue fighting all together against impunity, then we will make significant progress. But I'm realistic that I might not live to see that significant progress, is what I mean. What I meant by the attitude of leadership is that one of the things that that we looked at in our case in Malta, but also globally, is what makes the murder of a journalist possible. Because it takes a lot to put a bomb in someone's car and press the button. It takes a big number of people. It takes a lot psychologically to push the button. So what makes this possible? And what we found, at least in my mother's case, is that there are many years of dehumanization, many years in which politicians target journalists over and over and over and over again, calling them enemies of the people, dehumanizing them. In my mother's case, using a lot of gendered language, calling her a witch, fat, ugly, and so on. All of these kinds of insults that are used specifically for women. I have to point out that it always is much worse if you're a woman. And we could see that it was specifically this environment which was created top-down by leadership, which made it permissible to attack journalists, that in turn made it then possible or permissible for the murder of a journalist like my mother to take place. And this is something which happens everywhere. It is the attitude of leadership very often which creates this environment of impunity. If you have an environment that where there is impunity for minor crimes against journalists, like harassment, then of course there are people who are willing to push the envelope into murder.
Thank you, Matthew. I want to circle back to Thomas for a bit, and first maybe to highlight the fact that there's a special safety module that has been developed by the James Foley Foundation and with their partners in this, the Samir Asir Foundation, which can be found on their website. So there are a lot of resources on safety that there are being developed in our region, but also internationally. So this is one example, and it's really important to always highlight. But I also want to ask you, Tom, because the trial is currently in order, if you were to maybe describe a bit, how did it actually go to trial? I know that there must have been a very long and complicated process. I know that sometimes countries play a big role. Where the journalist is from, the situation where he was attacked, assassinated, kidnapped, or tortured also plays a role in this. But the process of actually getting to a place where the judiciary has been put under the spotlight and there are people who committed this who are to be sentenced or to be held responsible. How was this process for the family, for those who were following up on it? Because I know that there's no easy way, as you were saying, and sometimes a journalist is put under the spotlight, whether they like it or not, due to the sensitivity of the job.
So right now there's a trial going on for one individual. The other that was with him has already pleaded guilty. But these two individuals were held in Britain after being captured overseas. And there had to be agreements between the countries. The U.S. had to take the death penalty off the table in order for the trial to move to the United States, which was not an issue among the families, as far as I know. They were perfectly fine. They just wanted the justice to be served. They weren't looking for the death penalty. But once that was taken on the table, they were able to schedule something for the U.S. There was a brief time where both defendants were going to go on trial, but one again pleaded guilty, and then the other trial got pushed back, and it started about 2 weeks ago, and it's expected to be 3 weeks. So there had to be agreements between the governments on how the case would be handled, which is interesting from my perspective, because when the individuals like Jim and Stephen, some British citizens and citizens from around the world were being held, there was not agreement on how to get them out. There's different policies. There's different countries who can pay ransom, countries who cannot pay any sort of ransom. Like in the U.S., you are not allowed to, under violation of the law. They can tell you that and the Foley family was told, like, you could be in prison for raising a ransom. And so it's kind of almost bittersweet. Like you see these countries working together to get the justice after a murder of a journalist, but they weren't working necessarily together to get those journalists out. So they're hard lessons. And we were talking about the trials going on before, like it does reopen old wounds, but there is a sense of finality, hopefully, which, I mean, there'll never be closure, I'd say, but like there's like an end of this case. But it's been a really informative period, I guess is the best way to put it.
I mean, I can imagine that justice must feel nice to a certain extent. Coming from a country where we sadly don't get enough justice, we don't get justice at all in our context, and this is why I want to ask Khaled. We're all active on social media, but citizens are also active on social media. Everyone is basically online, posting and reposting, reading and sharing, and there has been large communities of support for different causes. Do you think that the public and the media or the social media at large can play a role in pushing to end impunity? Because we can talk about street protests, we can talk about governments sitting together, we can talk about reforms, but also there are voices on social media. Sometimes you have trends that are surfacing. Sometimes it's taking over a whole country, a whole context, the hashtags, and the whole attention. So do you think that there's a role? Sometimes we need to step forward. We need to put fighting impunity first, regardless of the context.
I think there is a big role to be played by the public. The public, they have a lot of power, and we have witnessed a lot of action taken by various governments due to the pressure by the public. And I mentioned to you the Irish example, but even in our countries, in many cases of the killed journalists, the public managed to play a role to force the governments to take some actions. I know the outcome is not something that desirable for us, but still we shouldn't lose hope. Always we have to mobilize the public, to use social media. And I have to mention the fact that the United Nations General Assembly adopted resolution 68/163 at its 86th session in 2013, which proclaimed the 2nd of November as the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. So we, as a Gulf Center for Human Rights, in cooperation with the UNESCO in Beirut and other NGOs, always, every year, with the involvement of public, media, and in cooperation with our partners, as I said, the journalist rights NGO, we hold a talk on this day, an exhibition, a discussion about the best ways to end impunity in our region. We start this discussion to which we invite media experts, civil society activists, and other experts to talk about ways to end this chronic problem, impunity. And also we invite the new generation of journalists, including students of media. They have to know that they have to be close to the real issues on impunity. One of them. Then we open a big exhibition that includes tens of pictures of the killed journalists across the MENA region. We celebrate their stories and we celebrate their lives. They have been killed for reporting the news and bringing information to the public, and we have to celebrate their lives. So that is every year. And that will show to you the importance of involvement in public in any action that you want to be successful in terms of impunity or other issues that are so important for our future.
Thank you, Khalid. Matthew, has the public maybe played a certain role in the issue of Daphne's assassination? What has been the reaction throughout the years in the country for your activism, for your insistence on ending impunity, on seeking justice? Because I know that every country has different priorities, and sometimes people tend to drift away to more urgent, maybe, or more timely to their daily lives needs, more timely issues to their daily lives needs. So how has the public at large been tackling this?
This is actually one of the most crucial things, which I forgot to mention earlier. I don't know why, because it's so important. But it's impossible to do this without reaching a critical mass of public support. So, I mean, even when it came to the path to justice, there are many obstacles that were in the way, and we had to remove them one by one. Of course, this would not have been possible without public support. One of the really final obstacles was the Prime Minister of the country himself, Joseph Muscat, who was close friends with the person who is now about to face trial for the murder. So it became clearer and clearer that he had to be removed from political power. This is something that cannot ordinarily be done without a huge amount of public support. So it was after weeks and weeks and weeks of public protests that were organized by civil society organizations, but which had a critical mass of public support, that the prime minister finally had to resign, because the protests were simply growing to the point where he would no longer quell them. And of course, once he resigned, then this really opened up a new path to justice, I think. So I would say that it's really important, which is of course why when protest movements arise, governments do go through, incur a great effort or make a great effort to suppress them. This is of course one of the reasons why they want people to forget.
Speaking of forgetting, I want to ask you, Tom, how important is the legacy of a journalist? And I know that there's no easy way to ask about this, because once you start admitting that you lost someone, you lost certain colleagues, certain friends, it's not something that you can move away from easily. But the legacy, specifically when it comes to their work, when it comes to what we've been talking about, safety, for example, the curriculums that your foundation has worked on, the insistence on safety, how important it is, the advocacy that Matthew has been talking about, Khalid as well, remembering the people and the journalists. And I'm not only talking in a nostalgic way, I'm talking in an effective, continuous way. How important is it based on your experience?
I think that's a great question, and it's there's obviously the personal aspect of securing someone's legacy and furthering someone's legacy. There's also like the list is growing too long of the number of journalists we have to remember, and there is a fatigue. And then part of it goes back to social media, in my opinion. I mean, obviously, you can get news and you can create movements and you can get critical support with, like Matthew has mentioned, but it is very difficult to keep people focused on a story for any amount of time. I mean, I feel like here in the U.S., the people are already worn out by Ukraine, and it's a war that's it's still in the beginning days. If you think about it, and there's already fatigue. So I think it's imperative for those of us that are close to people, to journalists that we've lost, to really emphasize their legacies in terms of inspiring the next generation of storytellers. And this is another point I think that Matthew made that's great, is that it's not about being pessimistic. I mean, that you can be optimistic about the work that journalists are doing and the future of journalists, because I think there will always be storytellers that want to go out there, but still be realistic about what's going on. And again, like I think it's really important to highlight the work that brave people are doing globally to bring stories to people, because I really don't think they realize that if these people weren't doing the work, they would not know what's going on in the world. And I don't think that people on the typical person, I guess, if that's the way to put it, recognizes how important that is.
That's so true.
Thank you, Tom. Matthew, I have a bit of maybe like not directly related to impunity question, but you yourself, you're a journalist. You work in the field, you are involved. So many of us, and I understand this, we do have some worries, we do have some fears, as Tom was saying, as Khalid was insisting as well. The list is growing. So many people that we have to remember. Safety and security are not something that you can ensure 100% for journalists. But personally, being someone who has, witnessed how it all goes down, I personally also lost very close colleagues of mine. How do you how do you push forward? What is one thing that drives you, knowing that impunity still exists? And as we all, I think, kind of agree that it's not going to disappear suddenly, it's not going to be an easy job, and we're not going to succeed at putting people in front of the judiciary system every time.
One of the things that really made me angry recently is that actually one of the I mean, Fox News, which is a great perpetrator of attacks on journalists and a kind of mockery of their work, and perpetrating the idea that journalists are all involved in a gigantic conspiracy to deceive people. I mean, what did they do? I mean, they were so desperate to get news from Ukraine that they hired inexperienced people, gave them absolutely no security training, sent them out into a war zone, and then the results were what they were. And what did they do in the end? They simply threw up their hands and said, it's not our responsibility. So they recognize behind the scenes that they do need people who are willing to take great risks in order to do this highly valuable work. But then when things go wrong, they don't step up and take any responsibility. And worse than that, they engage in these kinds of baseless attacks on journalists. So this is something which really made me angry recently.
Do you think, Khalid, that when we talk about mistakes of international and regional and local media, this is a bit of a controversial question, but do you think that media should be limited by a certain law, maybe to be held responsible when there are losses in lives specifically? Because here, you know, governments and politicians sometimes tends to try and be smart when it comes to any type of law. So when you mentioned laws regarding media, freedom of speech always is bumped into the first line, and then there are ways to put, you know, specific laws and labels on words and on what you can cover, what you can't cover. But when it comes to holding media institutions responsible for losses of lives, do you think that this is something that we might see globally at some point?
Well, this is really not an easy question, very complicated question. And I only speak about the MENA context. You know yourself, the traditional media in the Middle East, mostly owned by governments, and on occasions owned by the intelligence services themselves. So what kind of accountability we are going to force them to face? In a way or another, they are the perpetrators. My colleague Husham al-Hashmi, he was killed with bullets in daylight. Who killed him? Surely some people with political influence who managed to kill him using kind of a group of militants. And when you want to go to the media foundations, you see mostly they are owned by the same elements who have no belief in freedom of the press or in the protection of journalists. Now, if we go to the other part of the question, what is the role of the international organizations, maybe international parties who are really have concerns about safety of journalists in our region? Really, I see that they have limited effect and impact on our governments. We see always condemnation for attacks and violence against journalists and media workers. We see them urging states to do their utmost to prevent violence. We see them talking about justice, but in the real world, journalists in our region, really, on occasions, they are left alone. And that is what I am saying now. There should be more resources available to them, more accessible resources. You are talking about the life of a journalist. It is not just him or herself as one individual. We're talking about families, our neighbors, about friends. The imprisonment of Ahmed Mansour led to a lot of pain among all of us. So I believe the global media foundations, they could do more to prevent the killing of our colleagues in the MENA region. They could do more pressure. They should put human rights before profits when they are in our countries. They shouldn't just focus on ties with oppressive governments. They should show visibility. They should support the protection of independent journalists. We need to see more of good examples.
Thank you, Khalid. And I think that it's one thing to say is that, you know, the fight to protect freedom of speech and journalism is never ending. Based on my personal experience as a journalist, I have seen so many friends and support network and people and organizations step in. But once you are being attacked, once you are the target, it's a big and long and complicated chain that might take years of media and social literacy. As Tom was saying, I want to add social literacy as well, because it's fundamental for people to understand or to try to understand that you have the right not to agree with the person, but there's no need to go the extra mile and assassinate them or kill them or drive them out of their countries only because you disagree with what they're reporting on. I would like to thank you all, Thomas, Matthew, and Khalid, but I also want to leave the closing remarks for Olivier Boudard from the European Union in Lebanon, European Union Commission. We apologize, we did not have a lot of time to start with your opening remarks at first, but as we say in Lebanese, saving the best for last, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luna. Thank you very much. Very glad to be here today, and thank you for inviting us to exchange and to learn more about the difficulties of investigative journalists. And I really would like to start by paying tribute today to all journalists around the world who have lost their lives, like Diane and Daphne, in the exercise of their profession. A crime against one journalist is a crime against freedom of speech. It is a crime against our societies, our values, and most importantly, it is a crime against all of us. As we have heard today in this very important discussion, there are common issues between these two parts of the world, the European Union and the Middle East, and I could extend to North Africa. There are common issues, but there are also significant differences between in terms of the challenge faced by investigative journalists. In the region, of course, we have armed conflicts, we have terrorism charge against independent journalists, growing online surveillance and censorship, and restrictive cybercrime laws, making the region one of the most dangerous places for journalists to operate in. If we look at Europe, of course, I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic has crippled media revenues and also provided cover in many countries for greater restriction on press freedom. As was said, I mean, in 2020, more than 900 attacks took place against journalists in Europe, and it prompted the European Commission to present in November 2021 its first ever recommendation to the member states of the European Union to address this concern and strengthen the safety of journalists. Four recommendations were put forward by the European Commission. And it can be found online. I just want to focus on the first one, which is the general recommendation to our EU member states to investigate and prosecute all criminal acts making full use of existing national and European legislation. Key to guaranteeing freedom of the press and freedom of speech is an independent and efficient judiciary. It was said very clearly by Matthew. This is why the European Union and the Samuel Kathir Foundation engaged intensively in strengthening the capacity and independence of the judiciary, and especially in Lebanon, where the European Union have been closely following up in the last month the development links to the law on the independence of the judiciary. And we have welcomed the decision of the Parliament to postpone its adoption, giving more time and more space for an open and inclusive debate on the law. We also commend Lebanon's engagement with the Venice Commission, an organ of the Council of Europe, to bridge the draft law and bring, the draft law to international standard. Want to close again by praising the work of investigative journalists in a time of growing hostility against media. And it is really our collective duty to continue fighting for a free press and for the safety of journalists. And I thank you very much for that. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you for your support.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Olivier. Thomas, Matthew, and Khaled. Thomas, on behalf of Diane Foley, thank you so much for stepping in, for being with us. Matthew and Khaled, it's always a pleasure to communicate with you again. And we can't but hope that pushing forward and investing all of this energy will one day really take down a big part of impunity in our region and then also in the world, because it's cross borders. It's a problem that has been crossing all borders. Thank you so much, everyone, for this panel and for all of those who have been following and watching us on socials.
Thank you a lot, Luna, for your very kind effort. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
And have a nice day. Bye now.
Likewise. Thank you, Luna. I have no doubt that we'll get there.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Great day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.